Warmth in a Victorian home did not fill a house. It gathered in a single place and dared you to leave it. Everything beyond the glow of the fire existed in gradients of cold. Corridors that numbed the hands, bedrooms that stiffened the breath, floors that never forgot the night. Winter was not fought with comfort, but with strategy, patience, and quiet resignation. Heat was fragile. A fire could fail. Coal cost money. Curtains helped, but only slightly. Brick, glass, and wood offered no mercy once the sun fell. Families arranged their lives around the hearth, dressing not for fashion, but for survival, learning which rooms could be entered and which were to be avoided until spring returned. Cold was constant, and warmth, when it appeared, was temporary. If you find yourself drawn to these quieter truths of the past, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Tell me where you're watching from, and let's continue uncovering how ordinary life endured beneath the polished surface of the Victorian age, where staying warm was harder than you think, and winter ruled every decision. A Victorian house was never meant to be warm in the way modern rooms understand warmth. It was built for permanence, for display, for moral solidity, not for comfort. Thick brick walls promised stability and respectability, but they also stored the cold like memory. Once winter entered, it did not leave easily. It settled into the structure itself, absorbed by stone, timber, and plaster, lingering long after the fire had gone out. Heat, when it appeared, did not travel. It stayed close to its source, shrinking the livable world of the household to a narrow radius around the hearth. Beyond that circle, rooms cooled rapidly, becoming spaces to be passed through rather than occupied. Dining rooms chilled between meals. Bedrooms grew inhospitable by midnight. Hallways acted as cold corridors that drained warmth from anyone who lingered too long. The house functioned less as a unified shelter and more as a series of zones, some tolerable, others silently surrendered to winter. The architecture itself encouraged this division. High ceilings allowed warm air to rise and vanish uselessly above human reach. Large sash windows admitted precious daylight, but leaked cold with equal generosity. Fireplaces, though central to domestic life, were inefficient by nature. More heat escaped up the chimney than ever entered the room. What little warmth remained clung close to the fire, forcing furniture, bodies, and daily routines into tight, repetitive patterns. There was no expectation that the house should protect its inhabitants completely. Discomfort was assumed. Cold was accepted as part of indoor life, something to be managed rather than eliminated. To complain too openly about it suggested weakness, or worse, indulgence. Respectable households endured quietly, adjusting habits rather than demanding solutions. Chairs were pulled closer to the fire. Activities were consolidated into fewer rooms. Entire floors of the house fell dormant for months at a time. Even wealth did not guarantee comfort. Larger houses often fared worse, their size working against them. Heating multiple rooms required immense quantities of coal, labor, and attention. Most households chose restraint instead, focusing resources on a single parlor, while the rest of the house remained dim and cold. Servants moved between these spaces daily, carrying warmth in the form of coal scuttles and ash buckets, yet rarely enjoying its benefits themselves. The cold shaped behavior in subtle ways. Movement slowed. People lingered where heat existed and avoided unnecessary travel within their own homes. Mornings began reluctantly. The act of leaving bed a small act of courage. Evenings ended early. Once fires were banked, and the house surrendered again to the night. The domestic clock was set not by convenience, but by temperature. Victorian homes were praised as sanctuaries, moral centers of family life, order, and restraint. Yet beneath that ideal lay a quieter truth. These houses demanded adaptation. They required constant vigilance, labor, and acceptance of discomfort as a natural state. Warmth was never ambient, never guaranteed, and never free. It had to be earned each day, guarded each night, and rebuilt every morning. In such a house, winter did not feel like a season outside the walls. It felt internal, architectural, woven into the fabric of daily existence. The Victorian home stood firm against the world, but it did not soften it. Instead, it taught its occupants how to endure, quietly, persistently, and without expectation of relief. The fire was not a feature of the Victorian home. It was its authority. Every hour, every movement, every decision bent itself around the state of the hearth. When the fire was strong, the household functioned. When it weakened, the house contracted. When it died, winter reclaimed its territory without resistance. A day began with the fire, or more precisely, with its absence. Morning rooms were cold, untouched by heat from the night before. Ash lay gray and inert, the grate empty of comfort. Before breakfast could be served or letters written, the fire had to be coaxed back into existence. Coal was arranged carefully. Kindling was struck. Smoke briefly filled the room before the flames settled into something usable. Only then did the house begin its slow return to life. The fire demanded attention constantly. Left unattended, it burned too low. Overfed, it wasted precious fuel. Someone always watched it, adjusting vents, poking embers, adding coal sparingly. Warmth was never passive. It was maintained through vigilance and repetition, hour after hour, day after day. Even in prosperous homes, waste was frowned upon. Coal was costly, deliveries uncertain, and consumption carefully monitored. The radius of warmth defined daily behavior. Chairs clustered close to the hearth. Tables were positioned to capture what heat escaped the grate. Sewing, reading, writing, all tasks migrated toward the fire, competing for the narrow zone where fingers remained flexible and breath less visible. Beyond that space, the house waited in cold suspension. Meals were timed around the fire's strength. Tea cooled quickly in cold rooms. Food lost heat before it could be eaten if served too far from the hearth. Kitchens, paradoxically warm from labor, and stoves were often separate from the rooms where food was consumed, forcing heat to be carried and lost along the way. Nothing about warmth was efficient. At night, the fire dictated retreat. Once banked, its heat diminished steadily. Families withdrew early, not out of fatigue alone, but because the house no longer offered resistance to the cold. Bedrooms, never fully warmed, became endurance chambers, entered late and left reluctantly. The fire's surrender marked the end of social life for the day. The psychological power of the hearth was as strong as its physical influence. A burning fire suggested order, care, and respectability. A cold grate implied neglect, hardship, or moral failure. Visitors judged homes by the quality of their fires. A weak flame reflected poorly on the household, regardless of circumstance. Warmth became a symbol as much as a sensation. Servants bore the burden of the fire's demands. They rose early to revive it and stayed late to tend its decline. Their labor created comfort they were rarely permitted to enjoy. While families gathered near the hearth, servants moved between cold corridors and back rooms, carrying fuel and ash, their own warmth secondary to the household's display. The fire ruled the Victorian day because it had to. Without it, the house ceased to function as a living space. Yet even at its strongest, it offered only partial relief. It warmed unevenly, demanded constant sacrifice, and never allowed the illusion of abundance. It was a controlled flame in a cold world, essential, exhausting, and always temporary. In this way, the hearth became both lifeline and limitation. It sustained the household while reminding it constantly of how close comfort always stood to disappearance. As winter settled in, the Victorian house quietly surrendered parts of itself. This was not spoken of as loss, but it was understood. Certain rooms would no longer serve their intended purpose. They would exist in name only, present on the floor plan, absent from daily life. Doors were closed, curtains were drawn, fires were never laid. The house contracted inward, reducing itself to what could be sustained. Formal rooms were often the first to be relinquished. Dining rooms, built for gatherings and ceremony, grew intolerable between meals. Without constant heat, they became echoing chambers of cold air and polished surfaces. The long table sat unused, its wood chilled through, waiting for occasions worth the expense of fuel. Until then, meals were taken closer to warmth, informally, wherever the fire burned strongest. Upper floors followed soon after. Bedrooms beyond the primary sleeping chamber were rarely heated at all. Spare rooms became repositories for cold, their beds unused, their air stale. Children were sometimes moved together into a single room for warmth, not intimacy. Guests were fewer in winter, and when they did arrive, their accommodation was considered carefully, not for comfort, but for feasibility. Libraries and studies, spaces associated with quiet reflection, were often sacrificed despite their importance. Ink thickened in the cold. Fingers stiffened too quickly for writing. Books absorbed damp and chill, their pages curling faintly at the edges. These rooms waited patiently for spring, sealed against the cold as best they could be, yet never fully protected from it. Hallways and stairwells became transitional spaces only, endured, not occupied. Their purpose was movement, not rest. Lingering meant discomfort. The chill traveled freely through these vertical arteries of the house, carrying cold air downward, dispersing warmth upward and away from human reach. They connected rooms physically, while separating them thermally. The act of abandoning rooms was not dramatic. It happened gradually, through habit rather than decision. A door closed one day and was never reopened. A chair was removed and not replaced. A fireplace went an entire season without use. The house adapted, not by resisting winter, but by narrowing its own footprint. This contraction shaped domestic rhythm. Families learned which paths to take through their homes, which shortcuts minimized exposure, which rooms could be entered briefly without consequence. Children were warned not to linger where fires did not burn. Older residents moved cautiously, aware that cold aggravated joints and breath alike. The house instructed its inhabitants through discomfort. Abandoned rooms did not remain neutral. Cold settled into them deeply. Walls grew clammy. Air became heavy, unmoving. These spaces felt different, not dangerous, but unwelcoming. They reminded occupants that warmth was not a default condition of shelter, but a carefully maintained exception. There was also a social dimension to this seasonal abandonment. To keep many rooms heated suggested wealth bordering on excess. Restraint was admired. A household that limited its warmth appeared disciplined, respectable, properly ordered. Comfort beyond necessity invited quiet judgment. Cold, endured without complaint, was a mark of moral steadiness. By spring, these rooms would be reclaimed slowly. Windows opened, fires relit, furniture returned, but winter left its impression behind. A memory of spaces that had been present yet unusable, part of the home, but not of daily life. In the Victorian house, winter did not merely lower the temperature. It redrew the map of domestic existence, deciding which rooms mattered and which were allowed to sleep in the cold. Victorian houses were built to last, not to insulate. Their materials spoke of permanence, respectability, and order. Brick laid thick, stone foundations sunk deep, timber beams meant to endure generations. Yet these same virtues worked quietly against warmth. The house stood firm against time, but it offered little resistance to cold. Brick absorbed winter readily. It drank in the chill from the outside air and held it, radiating cold inward long after the frost had eased. Walls felt cold to the touch even beside a working fire, their mass slow to change, reluctant to yield. Once winter entered the structure, it became part of the house itself, lingering in corners, behind plaster, beneath floorboards. Glass, admired for its elegance and light, betrayed warmth without hesitation. Large sash windows were symbols of refinement, their proportions carefully chosen to admit daylight and display prosperity. But they leaked cold relentlessly. Even when shut tight, they rattled softly in the wind, admitting thin streams of air that slipped past curtains and settled near the floor. Frost often traced delicate patterns along the panes from the inside, a quiet reminder that the boundary between indoors and out was never secure. There was no true seal against the elements. Gaps existed everywhere, around window frames, beneath doors, along skirting boards. These were not flaws so much as accepted conditions. The enemy air moved freely, unseen but felt, cooling ankles and wrists first, then working its way inward. It was impossible to block entirely. One could only slow it. Floors contributed their own discomfort. Wooden boards shrank in dry winter air, opening seams that allowed cold to rise from below. In ground floor rooms, the chill crept upward steadily, indifferent to rugs or slippers. Even carpeted floors offered limited protection, their fibers thin barriers against air, drawn up from cellars and crawl spaces beneath the house. Ceilings, high and ornamental, completed the betrayal. Warm air rose quickly, collecting uselessly above head height. The very proportions meant to convey dignity ensured inefficiency. Heat gathered where it could not be felt, leaving those seated below, wrapped in layers, while warmth hovered just out of reach. Curtains, draft excluders, and heavy drapes attempted to negotiate with the architecture, but they were compromises at best. Thick fabrics slowed the cold but could not stop it. They darkened rooms and reduced airflow, trading one discomfort for another. Even fully dressed windows allowed the sense of cold to persist, pressing through cloth and wood alike. The Victorian house was therefore never truly enclosed. It was permeable, porous, constantly exchanging air with the outside world. This exchange was not considered entirely undesirable. Fresh air was associated with health and morality. Stagnation was feared more than cold. To seal a house completely would have seemed dangerous, even improper. Better to endure chill than risk corruption of the air. In this way, Warmth was always provisional. It existed despite the house, not because of it. Fires fought an ongoing battle against materials that refused cooperation. Every brick, every pane of glass, every draft acted as a quiet opponent, drawing heat away, dispersing it, reminding occupants that shelter did not equal comfort. The Victorian home stood proudly against weather and time, but it was never a refuge from cold in the modern sense. Instead, it was a structure that demanded adaptation, layering, vigilance, and acceptance. Brick and glass provided status and shelter, but they also ensured that winter was never fully excluded. The enemy air always found a way in, and the house, for all its strength, made little effort to stop it. Drafts were not accidents in the Victorian home. They were companions, persistent, familiar, and quietly accepted. No household expected to eliminate them entirely. One learned instead to anticipate their paths, to recognize their touch, and to adjust accordingly. Cold air announced itself first at the ankles, then at the wrists, then at the back of the neck. It never arrived suddenly. It crept. Every house had its known currents. A thin stream beneath the parlor door. A downward wash of cold along the staircase after sunset. A whisper of air slipping through window frames no matter how carefully they were shut. These drafts moved with intention, following routes carved by architecture and habit, reshaping the experience of space minute by minute. Furniture placement reflected this knowledge. Chairs were angled away from doorways. Tables were positioned where cold air traveled least. No one sat directly beneath a window unless necessary. The room was read not only by sight, but by sensation. You felt where the air moved, where it pooled, where it struck hardest. The house taught this awareness early and repeatedly. Efforts to block drafts were constant, but imperfect. Rolled cloths were pressed against door gaps. Heavy curtains were pulled tight at dusk. Screens were positioned near doorways, less for privacy than for defense. Even so, air found its way through. The house breathed whether its occupants wished it or not. Victorian construction encouraged this movement. Fireplaces drew air upward and out, pulling cold inward from elsewhere to replace it. A strong fire often meant stronger drafts, as the chimney demanded fuel in the form of air as much as coal. Comfort required compromise. A weaker fire reduced drafts, but surrendered heat. A stronger one warmed the room unevenly, while inviting the cold inside with renewed force. Footwear indoors was not optional in winter. Slippers were lined, boots worn longer than etiquette suggested. Children were cautioned not to sit on the floor, where drafts were strongest and unforgiving. Rugs layered over rugs attempted to soften the passage of cold, yet rarely succeeded entirely. Beneath them, air still moved. Drafts shaped posture and movement. People stood closer to the fire than manners allowed. They shifted seats unconsciously, turning shoulders away from cold currents. Conversation paused, while someone adjusted a curtain or shut a door already known to be imperfect. These interruptions were normal, barely noticed, part of the rhythm of winter living. There was also a moral framing to drafts. Fresh air was praised. To complain about it too openly suggested fragility. A slight chill was considered bracing, character building. Homes that were too warm invited suspicion. Comfort was tolerated only to a point. Beyond that, it implied excess. Illness was often blamed on drafts, yet they were rarely eliminated even when sickness followed. A cough developed, a fever lingered, and the explanation was, offered quietly, The air had turned. The solution was never structural. It was personal. More layers, fewer movements, greater endurance. Over time, drafts became invisible. Their presence registered not as surprise, but as expectation. You did not question why your hands cooled faster than your face, or why the room felt uneven. The house functioned as it always had. Cold moved. Warmth resisted briefly, then retreated. Living in a Victorian home meant accepting that air would not stay where it was told. It would move, seep, and intrude. You learned its habits as one learns the temperament of a place, not with frustration, but with resignation. Drafts were not failures of the home. They were part of its nature, and survival meant learning to live alongside them without complaint. Morning announced itself inside the Victorian home not with warmth, but with breath. Pale, faint, briefly visible in the air before disappearing. To wake and see one's own breathing was not unusual in winter. It was expected. The night had taken its full measure of the house, and by dawn, whatever heat remained had long since surrendered. Bedrooms were never warmed through the night. Fires were banked early, allowed to die slowly as sleep took hold. To maintain heat while unconscious was considered wasteful, even dangerous. Coal was too valuable, and vigilance could not be sustained in darkness. As a result, bedrooms cooled steadily for hours, walls radiating cold inward until the room matched the temperature outside with quiet efficiency. Waking required a moment of stillness. Movement exposed skin. Breath deepened. The body registered the cold fully only after consciousness returned. Hands emerged reluctantly from beneath blankets. Faces felt the air first. The rest followed in stages. It was not dramatic, but it was unmistakable. Getting out of bed was the hardest act of the day. The warmth gathered beneath layers vanished instantly once exposed. Floors, never insulated, punished bare feet. Even rugs offered little relief, their fibers cold and unyielding after a night of frost-fed air rising from below. Many lingered longer than necessary beneath covers, not out of laziness, but calculation, bracing themselves for what followed. Clothing was often laid out the night before, not for convenience, but survival. Garments left too long in the cold room stiffened slightly, their fabric holding the chill. Dressing became a swift, practiced ritual. There was no indulgence in comfort. Each layer added protection, though never enough to banish the cold entirely. Water offered no kindness in the morning. Washing was performed quickly, often with water barely warmed, sometimes not at all. Full bathing in winter was rare, postponed until conditions allowed. Cleanliness yielded to endurance. The cold dictated priorities. Children learned this early. They were taught to dress without delay, to move briskly, to accept discomfort without complaint. Morning breath was simply part of waking. It was not remarked upon unless it failed to appear, an indication that winter had finally loosened its hold. Bedrooms, despite their purpose, were among the least hospitable spaces in the house. They were private, removed from the hearth, and therefore low in priority when fuel was rationed. Comfort was expected to be temporary there, borrowed from blankets and shared body heat rather than architecture or fire. Illness often followed winter mornings. Coughs lingered, stiffness settled into joints. Yet the cold bedroom was rarely blamed openly. It was simply understood as part of the season's cost. The solution was never to heat the room more, but to endure better. Once dressed, the household migrated toward warmth. The fire, revived by early labor, offered limited relief. Fingers thawed slowly. Breath faded from sight. The day began only when the body re-entered the narrow circle of heat the house permitted. Morning breath indoors was not a failure of the Victorian home. It was evidence of its rules. Heat was not ambient. Comfort was not assumed. Survival required adaptation, routine, and restraint. Each morning reinforced this lesson quietly, with no need for instruction. To wake and see your breath was to be reminded immediately that winter had not left with the night, and that the house would offer only what it always did, just enough warmth to continue. Nightfall did not arrive gently in the Victorian home. It brought with it a measurable loss of light, of movement, and most importantly, of warmth. As the sun disappeared and gaslight replaced it, the house began to cool in earnest. What heat remained from the day thinned quickly, retreating toward the hearth like a final defense. Evenings were lived close to the fire. Chairs were drawn inward. Conversation tightened into smaller circles. Hands hovered near the grate, absorbing what warmth they could before it faded. Beyond that narrow perimeter, the house darkened and cooled, becoming less a place of habitation than a shell holding pockets of human presence. The fire itself was never allowed full freedom at night. To burn brightly after dusk risked running out of fuel before morning. Coal was added sparingly, not to increase warmth, but to prolong it. The goal was endurance, not comfort. A controlled decline was preferable to sudden extinction. As the fire weakened, so did the house's resistance. Cold crept back into the room from the edges first. It settled along the floor, climbed chair legs, brushed against hems and sleeves. It was felt before it was noticed, prompting subtle shifts in posture and position. No one remarked on it openly. Everyone understood what was happening. Gaslight provided illumination without heat. Its glow offered the illusion of warmth, but none of its substance. Shadows deepened as the temperature fell, corners growing heavy and indistinct. The house felt larger at night, its cold spaces pressing inward, reminding occupants how much of it had been surrendered earlier in the season. Night routines reflected this contraction. Activities slowed deliberately. Reading ceased once fingers numbed. Sewing became difficult. Social calls ended early. Guests departing before the cold became too uncomfortable to ignore. There was no sense in prolonging the evening when the house could no longer support it. Bedrooms waited, cold and unwelcoming. Entering them meant leaving the last warmth behind. Candles were carried carefully, their flames small and inadequate against the chill. The journey upstairs was often made quickly, coat still worn, breath visible once more as the body moved away from the fire's fading reach. Once the fire was banked and the grate quieted, the house entered a different state. It was no longer actively lived in, only endured. Walls cooled, floors stiffened. The structure reclaimed its winter equilibrium. Sleep became the only sensible response to a home that could offer nothing more. Blankets replaced architecture as insulation. Bodies huddled beneath layers, conserving warmth through stillness. Windows rattled faintly. Drafts resumed their quiet patrols. The house settled into its overnight condition, cold, dark, and resolute. There was no resentment in this surrender. It was expected, planned for, accepted. Nightfall was understood as a threshold beyond which comfort no longer applied. To resist it would have been wasteful, even improper. The collapse of heat each evening reinforced a lesson repeated daily throughout winter. Warmth was temporary, conditional, and always retreating. The Victorian home did not promise protection through the night. It offered shelter and little else, leaving its inhabitants to meet the cold with restraint, habit, and silence. By morning, the cycle would begin again. The fire would be reborn. The house would reawaken briefly. But for now, night ruled, and with it, the quiet, inevitable loss of heat. The Victorian parlor was meant to be warm, or at least it was meant to appear so. In illustrations, in etiquette manuals, in the carefully staged imagination of middle-class respectability, the parlor glowed. Fires burned generously. Curtains hung heavy and reassuring. Families gathered in effortless comfort, surrounded by softness, light, and calm. The reality was quieter, narrower, and far less forgiving. The parlor was not warm by default. It was warm by effort. Its comfort existed only so long as fuel was supplied, labor was constant, and restraint was observed everywhere else in the house. What appeared as ease was, in truth, concentration. Heat gathered deliberately into one space, while the rest of the home was left to cool. Even within the parlor, warmth was uneven. The chair nearest the fire was coveted, often claimed by age, illness, or authority. Others sat farther back, accepting lesser comfort without comment. Heat thinned quickly with distance. A few feet could mean the difference between numb fingers and relative ease. Social order arranged itself around this fact quietly. The fire itself was rarely as generous as it appeared. It was tended carefully, never allowed to blaze freely. Coal was added with calculation, not abundance. The goal was to maintain an impression of warmth without excess. Smoke had to be managed, drafts tolerated. Too much heat was as undesirable as too little. It suggested waste, indulgence, a lack of discipline. Parlors were staged spaces. Furniture was arranged not for comfort, but for appearance and propriety. Heavy drapes blocked drafts, but also dimmed light. Rugs softened floors, but trapped cold beneath. Decorative screens provided privacy and modest insulation, though they rarely altered the temperature meaningfully. Everything suggested coziness. Little actually delivered it. Visitors judged households by the parlor alone. A well-kept fire, a room that felt tolerable upon entry, implied success. What lay beyond was not inspected. Bedrooms could be freezing. Upper floors abandoned, kitchens exhausted by labor. None of this mattered so long as the parlor performed its role convincingly. This performance placed pressure on the household. Fuel was diverted to maintain appearances. Fires burned for guests that would not have been lit otherwise. Servants worked harder to uphold a standard that existed largely for display. Warmth became a social obligation, not a comfort. Children were taught to behave carefully in the parlor. Movement was restrained. Proximity to the fire was regulated. To sprawl or fidget risked blocking heat or disturbing the room's order. The parlor demanded stillness, not because it was warm, but because it needed to appear so. When the fire weakened, the illusion faltered. Cold returned first at the edges, creeping inward. Conversation slowed. Guests prepared to leave. The room reverted quickly to its true state once the effort ceased. Without fuel and attention, it was no different from the rest of the house. The myth of the cozy parlor endured because it served a purpose. It reassured. It represented control over environment, over season, over hardship. But it was never a reflection of daily reality. It was a carefully maintained exception. In the Victorian home, Warmth was not ambient, and comfort was not honest. The parlor did not disprove the cold. It merely concealed it for a time. Cold was not treated as an emergency in the Victorian home. It was not announced, nor resisted with urgency. It arrived each winter with certainty, settled in, and was absorbed into daily life without ceremony. What might later be described as hardship was, at the time, routine, anticipated, accommodated, and rarely questioned. From childhood onward, the body learned this rhythm. Cold rooms were expected. Chilled hands were ordinary. The sting of winter air indoors was met with adjustment rather than alarm. One reached for another layer, shifted closer to the fire, shortened one's movements. These responses were automatic, practiced over years of repetition. The house trained its occupants to respond calmly to discomfort. Language reflected this normalization. Rooms were described as brisk rather than cold. Mornings were sharp. Drafts were fresh. Such terms softened the reality, transforming physical challenge into moral texture. To endure cold quietly was considered sensible, even admirable. To complain suggested weakness or an inability to govern oneself properly. Household routines evolved around this acceptance. Tasks were grouped to minimize exposure. Washing was delayed. Writing was postponed until fingers could function. Certain activities were reserved for warmer months without regret. Life adjusted its pace to the season rather than demanding the environment adapt in return. Cold influenced posture and demeanor. Movement became economical. Stillness conserved warmth. Children were taught not to fidget, not merely for discipline, but because motion invited chill. Elderly members learned which chairs offered the least draft, which rooms held heat longest. This knowledge was rarely verbalized. It was acquired through experience and quietly passed on. Illness, when it came, was rarely attributed directly to the house. A cough was blamed on weather, constitution, or fate. The cold room was accepted as a contributing factor, but never an error to be corrected. Structural warmth was not the solution. Fortitude was. The distinction between discomfort and danger was carefully maintained. Cold was tolerable. Hunger, illness, or damp were threats. As long as these were kept at bay, the temperature itself remained secondary. A room could be cold and still considered suitable. Warmth was not a requirement for order or respectability. Even written accounts of domestic life minimized cold's presence. Letters mention weather outside more readily than conditions within. Diaries note frost on windows, but rarely remark on breath visible indoors. The cold was so embedded in daily existence that it ceased to merit description. This routine acceptance had consequences. It shaped architecture, labor expectations, and social behavior. Homes were not retrofitted aggressively against cold because endurance was cheaper than change. Fires were tended carefully rather than expanded. Comfort was rationed, not demanded. Over time, this approach hardened into cultural expectation. A household that endured winter without complaint was considered well-run. A family that sought excessive warmth risked judgment. The line between prudence and deprivation was thin, but carefully guarded. Cold, then, was not an event. It was a condition, as steady and predictable as daylight fading in winter months. The Victorian home did not dramatize it. It absorbed it, structured itself around it, and moved on. In this way, winter did not interrupt life. It reshaped it quietly, becoming part of the ordinary rhythm of living. Cold was not a crisis to be solved. It was a fact to be lived with, day after day, season after season, without expectation that things might ever be otherwise. Winter in the Victorian home was not something one stepped away from. There was no interior refuge where the season lost its authority. Once the cold arrived, it followed the household everywhere, from room to room, floor to floor, hour to hour. The idea of escape did not exist. Only degrees of endurance. The house offered shelter from wind and rain, but not from winter itself. Walls slowed the elements, they did not defeat them. Every interior space carried the season within it, altered only slightly by fire or habit. To move through the home was to move through variations of the same condition. Colder here, marginally warmer there, but never free. There was nowhere to retreat for relief. Bedrooms chilled overnight. Parlors cooled between fires. Kitchens, briefly warm from labor, lost their heat as soon as work ceased. Even the hearth could not sustain warmth indefinitely. It was a pause in winter's advance, not a barrier. Travel offered no solution. Leaving the house meant exposing oneself to greater cold. Returning brought no sudden comfort. Coats were kept on indoors, longer than etiquette suggested. Gloves were removed reluctantly. The threshold between outside and inside blurred in winter, both spaces governed by the same low temperature, differing only in degree. The body adjusted by lowering its expectations. Warmth became a temporary condition rather than a constant state. One learned to recognize moments of comfort as brief and conditional, to be used efficiently, not enjoyed excessively. Hands were warmed, tasks completed quickly, and movement resumed before the chill returned. Households organized themselves accordingly. There was no notion of warming up the house. There was only warming a room, then abandoning it once the effort no longer justified the cost. Fires migrated. People followed. The house was not a fixed refuge, but a shifting landscape of tolerable spaces. This lack of escape shaped the emotional texture of winter. There was a narrowing of activity, a turning inward, not from leisure, but necessity. Social life contracted. Evenings shortened. Ambitions deferred. Winter was endured rather than filled. Children grew up understanding this instinctively. They learned that comfort was not a given, and that winter demanded restraint. Play moved closer to the fire. Stillness was encouraged. Noise and movement were discouraged not merely for order, but for conservation of heat, of energy, of resources. Older members of the household felt winter most acutely. Stiffness lingered. Cold aggravated joints and breath. Yet even then, the idea of altering the house fundamentally rarely arose. Adaptation remained personal, not architectural. Extra layers replaced structural change. Blankets substituted for insulation. There was also a moral weight to this acceptance. Enduring winter, without complaint, was tied to character. The inability to escape cold became proof of discipline, patience, and proper conduct. Comfort was not owed. It was earned, briefly, and relinquished, without protest. Thus, winter permeated every corner of domestic life. It dictated posture, schedule, speech, and silence. The house did not stand against it. It accommodated it. Fires pushed back just enough cold to make life possible, but never enough to forget the season's presence. In the Victorian home, winter was not an external force pressing at the door. It was an internal condition, woven into daily existence. There was no escape, because none was expected. Survival did not mean overcoming the cold. It meant living within it, quietly, until the season chose to loosen its grip. Coal did not merely heat the Victorian home, it governed it. Measured, counted, stored, and guarded, coal functioned less as a convenience and more as a form of domestic currency. Every scuttle carried not just fuel, but judgment about what could be afforded, what could be spared, and how long winter might still last. The arrival of coal was an event. Delivered in sacks or heaps, it stained the threshold and announced itself with dust and weight. It was hauled inside by hand, sorted, and placed where it could be watched. Its presence offered reassurance, but never excess. No household believed its supply inexhaustible. Every fire burned with the knowledge that each piece consumed shortened the season's margin for error. Coal determined which rooms lived and which slept. A full scuttle meant the parlor could be kept tolerable for another evening. A dwindling pile meant retreat, fewer fires, shorter hours, colder mornings. Decisions about warmth were never abstract. They were counted out in lumps and shovelfuls, visible and finite. Household management revolved around this arithmetic. The head of the household monitored consumption closely. Servants were instructed carefully, sometimes sternly, on how much coal a fire was permitted to take. Too little meant discomfort. Too much suggested carelessness or defiance. The correct amount was learned through repetition, adjusted daily according to weather, supply, and social obligation. Coal blurred the line between necessity and display. A well-maintained fire suggested competence and respectability. A weak or absent one raised questions. Visitors noticed immediately, yet to burn too freely invited criticism of waste. The ideal lay in balance. Enough warmth to appear proper, never enough to appear indulgent. The cost of coal weighed heavily on working households. Winter budgets were shaped months in advance with fuel in mind. Other expenses contracted to accommodate it. Clothing was mended rather than replaced. Meals simplified. Comfort was traded quietly for endurance. Coal came first, because without it, the house could not function at all. Children learned its value early. They were warned away from the fire not only for safety, but preservation. Embers were not toys. Coal was not to be wasted. Even ash was sifted carefully. Remnants salvaged where possible. Nothing that could still give heat was discarded lightly. Coal also marked class division sharply. Wealthier homes could afford larger deliveries, more frequent fires, and a margin of comfort denied to others. Poorer households rationed severely, sometimes extinguishing fires altogether during daylight hours to save fuel for evening and morning. The cold was not experienced equally. It was distributed along economic lines. The labor behind coal remained largely unseen. It blackened hands, lungs, and clothing. It demanded constant handling. Servants bore the brunt of this work, rising early to revive fires and staying late to bank them. Their labor converted fuel into comfort for others, often at the expense of their own warmth. Coal shaped time as much as space. Fires were lit and allowed to fade according to schedules dictated by supply. The day's rhythm bent around fuel availability rather than preference. Life paused when coal ran low. Movement slowed. Rooms fell silent. In the Victorian home, coal was never simply burned. It was spent. Each fire represented a transaction. Warmth purchased at the cost of effort, money, and future security. To stay warm was not a matter of turning a knob. It was a calculation repeated daily until winter loosened its hold and the household could finally stop counting every piece of heat it consumed. Warmth in the Victorian home did not arrive quietly. It was carried, hauled, lifted by hand, day after day, regardless of weather, fatigue, or illness. Fuel was not abstract. It had weight, texture, and consequence, and every household felt its presence long before the fire ever caught. Coal entered the home through labor. It was fetched from cellars, sheds, or yards, where it lay piled and exposed to damp and dust. Each scuttle filled meant bent backs and blackened fingers. The metal container itself was heavy even before it was loaded. To carry it upstairs or across long corridors was to feel warmth as exertion rather than comfort. This work was repetitive and unending. Fires did not remain lit by intention alone. They demanded constant feeding, their appetite measured but persistent. A cold day required more fuel. A damp one required vigilance. There was no such thing as a single effort that lasted the day. Heat consumed itself steadily and had to be replaced. Servants bore most of this burden, though smaller households often had no one to spare. In such homes, the labor fell to whoever was able: women, older children, sometimes the ill. The work was considered ordinary beneath comment. To complain about it would have seemed indulgent. Fuel had to be moved. That was simply how winter functioned. The path of coal through the house shaped daily movement. Stairs became routes of burden. Narrow hallways echoed with the scrape of scuttles against walls. Ash was carried back the same way, warm at first, then cooling rapidly, leaving gray traces on skirts and sleeves. The cycle never paused. Coal in, ash out. Warmth gained, warmth lost. This labor left its mark. Hands were perpetually dry and stained. Clothing smelled faintly of soot. Lungs filled with fine dust that never fully settled. These signs were accepted as part of respectable domestic life. Cleanliness was restored only partially. No amount of washing could erase winter entirely. Fuel also demanded planning. Fires were anticipated hours ahead. Coal was moved early in the day to avoid multiple trips. Scuttles were placed strategically, ready to serve more than one room if needed. Every movement was calculated to conserve energy as much as fuel. Waste applied to labor as well as heat. There was no anonymity to this effort. Each piece of coal was visible, each trip counted. The household was constantly aware of the labor that sustained warmth, even if it was not acknowledged aloud. Comfort carried with it the knowledge of effort expended elsewhere, by someone else. At night, the burden did not fully lift. Fires were banked carefully, requiring another round of attention. Coal was arranged to burn slowly. Ashes were shifted to preserve embers. These acts were performed deliberately, with an eye toward the morning's cold. A poorly tended fire meant a harsher dawn. The daily burden of fuel reinforced a truth that winter made impossible to ignore. Warmth was not a state. It was a process, one that demanded repetition, strength, and acceptance. Heat was never simply enjoyed. It was earned continuously through labor that left its trace on the body and the house alike. In the Victorian home, staying warm was not passive. It was carried, piece by piece, through corridors and across hours, until the season finally released its grip, and the scuttle could, for a time, be set aside. Warmth in the Victorian home always left a mark. It did not arrive cleanly, nor did it depart without evidence. Every fire, however carefully tended, produced residue. Ash that gathered silently, soot that drifted and settled, and walls that darkened gradually over time. These traces were not failures of housekeeping. They were the physical cost of survival through winter. Ash accumulated daily. It filled grates and hearths, soft at first, then compacted and heavy once cooled. It had to be removed regularly, yet never entirely. Too thorough a cleaning risked extinguishing embers that might be needed later. Too little allowed airflow to suffer. The correct balance was learned through habit rather than instruction. Ash was managed, not eliminated. Its removal was a task performed early, before the fire was rebuilt. Warm ash burned through thin metal and careless hands alike. Buckets were carried cautiously, their contents faintly alive with heat. Outside, ash was discarded carefully, sometimes saved, sometimes spread, sometimes simply dumped where it would not blow back into the house. Even in removal, it threatened return. Soot behaved differently. It was finer, more insidious. It traveled upward through chimneys, settled along mantelpieces, and crept into fabric and wallpaper. It clung to picture frames and cornices, leaving faint shadows that grew darker each season. No amount of dusting removed it entirely. It was absorbed into the house itself. Walls told the story of winter better than words. Pale paper yellowed near fireplaces. Whites dulled into gray. Corners closest to the hearth grew visibly darker, while distant walls retained a cold, washed-out hue. These patterns marked where warmth had reached and where it had not. They mapped the fire's influence more accurately than any memory. Cleaning attempted to negotiate with this reality. Grates were scrubbed, hearthstones scoured, mantles wiped daily. Yet each act of cleaning was temporary. Soot returned. Ash reappeared. The house resisted any illusion of permanence. Heat always demanded consequence. This residue extended beyond surfaces. Clothing absorbed smoke. Hair carried its scent. Curtains darkened unevenly. Even bedding near frequently used rooms bore traces of coal and fire. Winter was not contained to one room. It migrated through touch, air, and habit. Servants bore the brunt of this maintenance. Cleaning ash and soot was labor-intensive, repetitive, and never complete. Hands cracked. Knees wore thin against stone hearths. The work produced little visible reward. A clean hearth today would be marked again tomorrow. Yet the task was essential. To neglect it suggested disorder, even moral failure. There was also an acceptance that complete cleanliness was impossible in winter. Standards adjusted quietly. A certain dullness was tolerated. Blackened corners were overlooked. Respectability allowed for seasonal wear, acknowledging that survival left traces no household could fully erase. Ash and soot became part of the domestic atmosphere. Their presence was not remarked upon unless excessive. They were expected companions to warmth, reminders that comfort was achieved through combustion, not convenience. The Victorian home did not separate heat from its byproducts. It lived with them. In time, these residues became historical layers within the house. Walls bore years of winters in their discoloration. Chimneys accumulated evidence of countless fires. The home aged visibly with each season endured. To stay warm was to accept this slow darkening. The Victorian household understood that warmth left its stain on walls, on hands, on daily life itself. Clean heat was not an option. Survival required flame, and flame always left ash behind. The Victorian fireplace was trusted, relied upon, and quietly resented. It stood as the heart of the home, yet it was profoundly inefficient. For all the labor it demanded and fuel it devoured, it returned only a fraction of what it consumed. Most of the heat it produced vanished upward, drawn inexorably into the chimney and released to the winter sky. This loss was understood, if rarely articulated. Anyone who stood before a fire felt the contradiction immediately. The face warmed quickly, almost uncomfortably, while the back remained cold. Turned slightly, and the balance reversed. Warmth existed only in direct negotiation with flame, dependent on proximity and position. The room itself gained little lasting benefit. The chimney was the true beneficiary. Designed to draw smoke upward efficiently, it also carried heat with it, creating a constant pull of air from the room. Cold rushed in to replace what escaped, entering through cracks, gaps, and floorboards. A strong fire often meant stronger drafts. Comfort was never straightforward. Every gain arrived with an accompanying loss. Fireplaces varied in design, but few improved efficiency meaningfully. Decorative surrounds and iron grates gave the impression of refinement, yet they altered little about performance. The fire still burned openly, exposed to the room, sending most of its warmth upward rather than outward. Innovations existed, but adoption was slow and uneven. Tradition often outweighed improvement. Coal disappeared rapidly. A fire that looked modest consumed fuel steadily, hour after hour. What seemed like restraint still exacted a high cost. Households learned to read the fire carefully, gauging how long it might last, how much warmth it might still provide before surrendering to ash. The fire was never allowed indulgence. It was managed constantly, watched for signs of waste. Even so, disappointment lingered. Rooms warmed unevenly. Large spaces remained cold despite active fires. Heat failed to reach corners, ceilings, or adjacent rooms. The fireplace demanded fuel and attention, yet refused to offer total relief. It worked just well enough to justify its existence, never well enough to resolve the problem it was meant to solve. This inefficiency shaped domestic behavior deeply. Families clustered tightly around the hearth, knowing warmth would not extend beyond its immediate reach. Furniture arrangements acknowledged this reality. The fire dictated where life occurred, not the architecture of the house. Rooms were not warmed for use. They were used because they could be warmed, briefly and imperfectly. Servants adapted to this limitation with skill and resignation. They learned how to bank fires to slow their consumption, how to coax embers into renewed life without wasting coal. Even so, loss was unavoidable. Heat escaped. Cold entered. The balance was never favorable. There was a psychological weight to this inefficiency. The constant effort required to maintain modest warmth reinforced a sense of limitation. No matter how diligently one worked, the environment resisted improvement. Comfort could be increased only marginally, temporarily, and at cost. The Victorian fireplace promised warmth, but delivered compromise. It consumed more than it gave, yet there was no alternative. The house accepted this imbalance as the price of survival. Fire was imperfect, wasteful, and essential. A reminder that in the Victorian home, even the central source of warmth was an unreliable ally. Heat was borrowed, not owned. And the fireplace, for all its symbolism, ensured that winter was never fully defeated, only held at bay for as long as fuel and effort allowed. Warmth in the Victorian home began long before the household stirred. It began in darkness, with footsteps on cold stone and hands already numb from the night air. While others slept, servants rose to face the house in its most hostile state, when fires were dead, rooms unyielding, and winter fully in command. Before light reached the windows, grates were cleared and ash carried away. The hearth was rebuilt carefully, layer by layer, with an economy learned through repetition. Too much coal wasted heat that would vanish up the chimney. Too little meant failure, a weak flame that would not revive the house. The balance was exacting, and mistakes were felt immediately. Matches were struck quietly. Smoke crept into the room before the draft took hold. For a few moments, the cold resisted. Then slowly, the fire caught. It did not warm the servant who built it. That warmth was reserved for later, for others. The labor belonged to the early hours, the comfort to those who would wake after. Servants moved through rooms that were still dark and colder than the outside air. Stairs were climbed repeatedly, with scuttles that grew heavier with fatigue. Doors were opened and closed to manage drafts, though the cold paid little attention. Each fire required attention in turn, and there were never enough hands to hurry the process. This work was not considered extraordinary. It was expected, routine, invisible. A warm parlor in the morning was taken as evidence of a well-run house, not of early labor performed elsewhere. Success meant absence, the absence of smoke, the absence of chill, the absence of delay. Failure was noticed immediately. The servants themselves remained cold long after the fires burned. Their quarters were rarely prioritized. By the time warmth reached them, if it did at all, the day's work had already taken its toll. Hands cracked. Backs ached. Breath lingered in the air long after the household had ceased to notice it. Illness did not excuse the task. Fires could not wait. A cold house reflected poorly on the household as a whole, and so the labor continued regardless of condition. Winter allowed little sympathy. It demanded consistency. There was an order to this early rising. The most important rooms were attended first. Public spaces, places of display, were warmed before private comfort was considered. The hierarchy of heat mirrored the hierarchy of the household itself. Warmth flowed downward, not upward. Servants learned to read the house intimately. They knew which chimneys drew well, which rooms resisted heat longest, which doors leaked air most persistently. This knowledge was practical, uncelebrated, and essential. Without it, the house would not function. By the time the household emerged, the worst of the cold had been pushed back just enough to allow the day to begin. Fires burned steadily. Rooms felt tolerable. The illusion of effortless warmth was complete. Yet the work never truly ended. Fires required feeding throughout the day. Ash had to be cleared again. Evening demanded another round of care. And tomorrow, before dawn, the process would begin anew. In the Victorian home, warmth was not a shared experience. It was produced by some and enjoyed by others. Those who rose before dawn bore winter at its harshest so that the house could appear later to resist it at all. In the Victorian home, clothing did not end at the threshold. It continued indoors, layer upon layer, transforming the body itself into a barrier against the cold the house could not defeat. Dress was not merely social expression in winter. It was survival made visible, worn quietly beneath manners and routine. Garments were chosen with calculation. Wool held heat better than cotton. Thick skirts trapped air. Waistcoats and shawls provided portable warmth that could move where fires could not. Even indoors, coats were kept close, sometimes worn longer than etiquette prescribed. To remove too many layers too soon was to invite discomfort that the house would not correct. Morning dressing, was a strategic act. The day's clothing had to account not only for weather outside, but for the temperature of rooms within. A parlor might be tolerable. A hallway would not be. Bedrooms remained cold long after dawn. One dressed for transition, not stability, layering against the certainty that warmth would be uneven and temporary. Women's clothing, often imagined as decorative, served a practical purpose in winter. Heavy skirts insulated legs from cold floors. Corsets, though restrictive, held layers close to the body, reducing drafts against the skin. Shawls were indispensable, easily added or removed as one moved between rooms of differing temperatures. They were warmth made adaptable. Men layered similarly. Waistcoats beneath coats, scarves at the neck, gloves kept on indoors, longer than fashion plates suggested. The exposed throat and hands were constant vulnerabilities. Clothing compensated where architecture failed. Children were bundled without debate. Movement was limited by fabric as much as by instruction. Warmth justified restriction. A child who complained of stiffness or weight was reminded of the cold waiting beyond the fire's reach. Endurance was taught early, through clothing as much as discipline. Night offered no reprieve. Bedclothes replaced garments as insulation. Layers of blankets substituted for heating the room itself. Nightcaps were worn to retain warmth. Sleep required stillness, not comfort. The body conserved heat by limiting movement, wrapped in fabric rather than relying on fire. Clothing also carried social meaning. To dress warmly indoors could suggest fragility or indulgence if taken too far. Layers were added discreetly, without comment. The goal was to remain functional without appearing to seek excessive comfort. Endurance was admired. Visible attempts to defeat the cold were not. Servants experienced this reality most sharply. Their work demanded movement through cold spaces, often without the benefit of layered clothing allowed to the household. Their garments were practical, worn for labor rather than warmth. Exposure was constant. Clothing mitigated but did not eliminate discomfort. Over time, the body adjusted. Cold tolerance increased. Sensitivity dulled. Layers became habitual rather than noticeable. Clothing ceased to feel heavy. It became an extension of the self, a portable shelter carried through the house. In the Victorian home, architecture offered limited protection. Fires offered localized relief. Clothing filled the gap between. It followed the body where warmth could not, adapting to conditions that never stabilized. Comfort was not assumed. It was assembled, piece by piece, button by button, each morning anew. Warmth was worn, not provided. The Victorian home relied heavily on soft defenses. Where brick and glass failed, fabric was enlisted. Curtains were drawn, rugs unfurled, screens positioned with care, not to banish the cold, but to suggest its containment. These measures worked as much on the mind as on the air, creating an impression of warmth that rarely matched reality. Curtains were the first line of this quiet negotiation. Heavy drapes were pulled tight at dusk, sealing windows that never truly sealed themselves. Thick folds dulled the rattle of glass and softened the feel of drafts, though they could not stop them. Cold pressed through regardless, slowed but undeterred. The fabric did not block winter. It merely delayed its touch. Their presence altered the room's mood immediately. Light dimmed, edges softened. The space felt smaller, more enclosed. This contraction was welcome. A reduced room was easier to imagine as warm, even if the temperature barely changed. The curtain's true function lay in perception, turning exposure into enclosure through suggestion alone. Rugs performed a similar service. Spread generously across wooden floors, they promised insulation where none truly existed. They softened footfall, muffled sound, and offered psychological relief from the knowledge of cold air rising beneath the boards. Feet felt less punished. Movement seemed safer. Yet the cold continued its ascent, filtering through fibers and seams, undiminished in intent. Layered rugs were common, one atop another, their patterns overlapping. This abundance suggested luxury, even if it masked discomfort rather than eliminated it. Beneath them, floorboards remained cold to the core. The house retained its winter equilibrium, regardless of how much cloth was laid upon it. Screens and furniture placement joined this effort. Folding screens stood near doorways, intercepting drafts that slipped in uninvited. Chairs were arranged to face away from cold currents, angled toward the hearth in carefully practiced positions. These arrangements changed the experience of cold without changing the cause. The illusion required maintenance. Curtains had to be adjusted constantly. Rugs shifted and curled. Screens were moved as drafts changed direction. The house was not static. Its currents altered with weather, fire strength, and time of day. The illusion of warmth demanded attention. There was an understanding that these measures were symbolic as much as practical. To sit in a curtained, rug-lined room felt civilized, ordered, respectable. It suggested mastery over environment, even if that mastery was incomplete. The appearance of comfort mattered. It reassured occupants and impressed visitors alike. Households invested considerable effort into these soft barriers because they were accessible. Structural change was expensive and disruptive. Fabric offered a gentler solution: adaptable, removable, seasonal. It could be added in winter and withdrawn in spring, restoring light and air without altering the house itself. Servants bore the responsibility of maintaining this illusion. They drew curtains at the correct hour, beat rugs free of ash and dust, repositioned screens as needed. Their work ensured the room looked and felt prepared, even if the temperature told a different story. Over time, occupants learned to accept the illusion as sufficient. A room need not be warm to be considered tolerable. It needed only to feel contained. Curtains and rugs accomplished this quietly, reducing the sensation of exposure even when they failed to alter the cold itself. In the Victorian home, comfort was often a matter of perception rather than condition. Fabric softened winter's presence without confronting it directly. The cold remained, patient and persistent, but it was dressed, veiled behind drapes and patterns, transformed into something that could be endured without constant awareness. Warmth was suggested, not secured. And for most households, that suggestion was enough to carry them through another evening. Hot water was never assumed in the Victorian home. It was requested, prepared, and rationed, an event rather than a condition. To experience true warmth through water required planning, labor, and a tolerance for inconvenience that shaped daily habits as thoroughly as the cold itself. Water did not arrive warm. It was drawn cold from pumps, cisterns, or wells, often colder indoors than out during winter months. To heat it required fire, and fire demanded fuel already stretched thin. Every kettle placed on the grate competed with the needs of the room itself. To warm water was to divert heat from air to vessel, a choice weighed carefully. As a result, hot water was used sparingly and purposefully. Washing hands or faces might be permitted briefly, quickly, before the water cooled beyond use. Full washing was rare in winter, postponed or abbreviated. Bathing, when it occurred at all, was an undertaking reserved for special occasions or warmer seasons. The cold dictated standards of cleanliness as firmly as any moral code. In households with servants, water was heated manually in kitchens or sculleries, poured into basins, and carried upstairs with care. Each trip represented effort and risk, of spillage, of wasted heat, of injury on cold stairs. Water cooled rapidly in transit, arriving warm rather than hot, its usefulness already diminishing. The experience of washing was therefore brief and deliberate. There was no lingering comfort. Skin met warmth for a moment, then returned quickly to cold air. The contrast was sharp, almost punishing. Many avoided the experience altogether, preferring steady cold to the shock of temporary relief followed by immediate chill. Clothing absorbed moisture reluctantly in winter. Damp fabric clung to the body, drawing heat away. Washing garments created new problems. Drying required space near the fire, competing with people for warmth. Laundry was timed carefully, often delayed until conditions improved. Cleanliness bent to practicality. Hot water for illness was valued, but still limited. Compresses, broths, and warming measures were employed cautiously, mindful of fuel constraints. Even in sickness, warmth was not abundant. Comfort was administered in measured doses, never extravagantly. Children learned early that warm water was not a right. They washed quickly, with supervision, instructed not to waste heat. Play did not include baths or splashing. Warmth through water was serious, functional, and brief. For the wealthiest households, hot water could be more readily obtained. But even there, it was not constant. Systems existed to heat water more efficiently, yet they still relied on fuel and labor. The sense of hot water as something earned rather than given remained. The absence of readily available hot water shaped the relationship between body and cold. People accepted a baseline of chill. Warmth was experienced through clothing and fire rather than through immersion. The body adapted by reducing expectation, becoming accustomed to cold skin and cooler air. In the Victorian home, water did not soften winter. It obeyed it. Heat applied to water was temporary, costly, and fleeting. To feel warmth through washing was a brief indulgence, quickly surrendered. Hot water was not part of daily comfort. It was a luxury, carefully rationed, and never allowed to linger long enough to suggest that winter might be defeated at all. Cold in the Victorian home was not dramatic, but it was persistent, and persistence had consequences. Illness did not arrive suddenly with winter storms. It accumulated quietly, shaped by rooms that never fully warmed, by damp walls, chilled floors, and air that moved endlessly through spaces meant for rest. Bedrooms were the most dangerous in this regard. They were cold by design, unheated through the night, slow to warm even after dawn. Sleep occurred in stillness, but stillness did not guarantee warmth. Breath condensed. Moisture settled on walls and linens. The body remained wrapped, yet never insulated completely. Over time, this exposure exacted its toll. Coughs lingered throughout winter months. Chest complaints became common, accepted as seasonal companions rather than ailments to be prevented. A winter cough required no explanation. It was not traced to a specific cause. It belonged to the house, to the air, to the season itself. Cold aggravated weakness already present. The elderly stiffened and slowed. Joints ached persistently. Those with fragile health declined more quickly in winter. Their strength eroded not by a single illness, but by prolonged exposure to chill. Recovery was slow, often incomplete, as warmth remained inconsistent even during convalescence. Children were especially vulnerable. Though wrapped and watched, they moved between cold rooms daily, their bodies adapting imperfectly. Fevers followed drafts. Sore throats appeared after nights spent in chilled bedrooms. Yet these ailments were rarely attributed to the home. They were blamed on constitution, temperament, or fate. Medical understanding of the time reinforced this acceptance. Cold was considered an influence rather than a cause, something that weakened the body's defenses, making illness more likely but never fully responsible. This framing allowed the house itself to escape scrutiny. The environment was endured, not questioned. Treatment rarely involved increasing warmth structurally. Instead, remedies focused on the individual. Extra blankets, warm drinks, rest near the fire when possible. Illness was managed within the same constraints as health. Fuel limits did not relax simply because someone was unwell. Comfort expanded slightly, but never freely. Servants were often the most exposed. Their work carried them through unheated spaces repeatedly, from cellar to upper floors, from kitchen to scullery, from room to room. Illness among servants was common, yet largely invisible. Work continued as long as movement was possible. Warmth remained secondary to duty. There was a quiet resignation to winter sickness. It was anticipated, not feared. Households accepted that health would deteriorate during cold months and recover partially in spring. This cycle shaped expectations. Survival mattered more than comfort. Endurance mattered more than prevention. Letters and diaries mention illness briefly, almost casually. A cough noted. A fever passed. Rarely is the house itself named as a culprit. Cold rooms were not seen as errors in design or management. They were facts of existence. Thus, illness became part of winter's rhythm, another cost of living in a house that could not shield its occupants fully. Fires burned, curtains were drawn, layers were added. Yet cold remained embedded in walls and floors, quietly influencing health without ever being confronted directly. In the Victorian home, illness did not provoke reform. It reinforced acceptance. Cold rooms were endured, sickness managed, and winter allowed to take what it would. The house remained unchanged, its chill an unspoken contributor to the season's quiet toll on the body. A Victorian winter was not measured by snowfalls or storms, but by what remained when it ended. When spring finally loosened its grip, households assessed survival not in comfort regained, but in resources spent, strength diminished, and quiet compromises made along the way. Winter exacted its cost slowly, invisibly, until it was already paid. Fuel was the most obvious expense. Coal disappeared steadily, sack by sack, until reserves thinned and deliveries became matters of anxiety rather than routine. The calculation began long before the first frost. How much could be afforded? How long it must last? Which rooms would be heated and which would not? Every fire lit shortened the margin for error. By late winter, the arithmetic grew tighter. Fires burned lower, hours shortened. Comfort was pared back to essentials. Money flowed outward in winter, rarely returning. Savings accumulated in warmer months were consumed quietly by cold. What could not be afforded in coal was made up for in endurance. Households that survived without debt considered themselves fortunate. Those that did not carried winter with them into the year that followed. Labor carried its own cost. The effort required to sustain even minimal warmth wore down bodies over time. Backs ached from lifting scuttles. Hands cracked from ash and cold water. Fatigue accumulated daily, rarely acknowledged. Rest was scarce in winter because the house demanded constant attention. Fires did not tend themselves. Ash did not clear itself. Survival required movement even when the body asked for stillness. Health suffered subtly but persistently. Illness lingered longer. Recovery slowed. Strength diminished gradually, often unnoticed until spring revealed its absence. Winter did not always kill. It weakened. It left behind bodies that moved more cautiously, breathed more shallowly, and tired more quickly than before. Clothing bore winter's mark as well. Fabrics wore thin under constant use. Garments absorbed soot and damp, shortening their lifespan. Repairs replaced replacement. Mending became a necessity rather than a choice. By spring, wardrobes showed the season's passage in frayed cuffs and dulled cloth. The house itself aged under winter's pressure. Walls darkened further near the hearth. Chimneys accumulated residue. Floors warped slightly under cold and damp. These changes were accepted as inevitable, even honorable. Signs of a house that had endured another season of use. Social life contracted during winter and did not immediately rebound. Habits of restraint persisted. Even when warmth returned, households remained cautious, mindful of how close scarcity had come. Winter taught conservatism, and its lessons lingered. Children emerged from winter altered. They grew accustomed to limitation, to stillness, to restraint. These habits shaped them quietly, reinforcing expectations that comfort was conditional and effort unending. Winter was a teacher, and its curriculum was patience. When spring arrived, it did not erase the cost. It merely halted its accumulation. Windows opened. Fires burned less often. Movement expanded. Yet the memory of winter remained embedded in habits, in posture, in the careful way households continued to manage resources even when the cold had passed. A single Victorian winter did not end with thaw. It left traces everywhere, in accounts, in bodies, in walls, in expectations. Survival was not dramatic. It was incremental, paid for in small sacrifices repeated daily until the season finally released its hold. The house stood intact. The household endured. And that endurance, rather than comfort, was counted as the true measure of success. Warmth in the Victorian home was never distributed evenly. It followed lines already drawn, of class, age, authority, and usefulness. Heat moved through the house the way power did, selectively, deliberately, and with little apology. The warmest place belonged to the head of the household, or to whoever embodied its authority. The chair nearest the fire was not claimed casually. It was assumed. Age, status, and health justified proximity. Others arranged themselves accordingly, accepting cooler positions without comment. The fire warmed hierarchy as much as it warmed flesh. Children were granted warmth conditionally. The very young might be placed close to the hearth, wrapped and watched. Older children learned restraint early. They were expected to tolerate chill without complaint, their endurance framed as character building. Warmth was a privilege to be earned through obedience and stillness, not a constant to be expected. Guests altered the equation temporarily. Fires burned brighter when visitors were present. Coal was spent more freely. The appearance of comfort mattered. Yet this generosity was performative and brief. Once the visitor departed, the house returned quickly to its normal economy, the warmth withdrawn as efficiently as it had been offered. Servants occupied the cold margins. Their labor moved them constantly between rooms, yet their access to heat was incidental. They warmed themselves in passing, briefly, while tending fires meant for others. Their quarters were rarely prioritized. Warmth was not withheld deliberately. It was simply not assigned to them. Their role required endurance, and endurance was assumed. Illness could shift these boundaries slightly. A sick family member might be granted additional warmth, moved closer to the fire, given extra blankets. Yet even this had limits. The house did not reorganize itself entirely around recovery. Care existed within the same constraints as health. Fuel remained finite. Fires, still, burned unevenly. Gender played its part. Women, often confined indoors, bore prolonged exposure to cold rooms while managing households that could not be fully warmed. Their labor occurred near fires, yet rarely paused long enough to benefit fully from them. Men, moving between indoors and out, accepted cold as part of public life and carried it back inside without expectation of relief. Warmth was also temporal. Certain hours allowed greater access. Evenings near the fire offered brief comfort. Nights withdrew it. Mornings delayed it. One learned not only where warmth existed, but when. To be warm required being in the right place at the right time, and knowing when to relinquish it. These rules were rarely stated. They were understood through repetition. A child learned where to sit. A servant learned when to linger. A guest learned how long hospitality lasted. The house instructed its occupants silently, correcting misjudgments through discomfort rather than reprimand. Inequality of warmth mirrored inequality of life. Those with greater resources enjoyed more consistent relief. Larger fires, more fuel, additional rooms kept tolerable. Yet even wealth did not erase hierarchy. Warmth remained concentrated, not ambient. Someone always sat farther from the fire. The Victorian home did not aim for universal comfort. It aimed for order. Warmth was allocated to preserve function and appearance, not to satisfy everybody equally. This allocation reinforced social structure daily, subtly, without need for explanation. To be warm was not simply to escape cold. It was to occupy a particular position within the household. Others endured by design. The house, like society beyond its walls, made clear distinctions, and winter enforced them relentlessly. The cold settled most deeply, where it was least discussed. In the servants' quarters, winter was not negotiated. It was endured. These rooms, tucked into attics, basements, or narrow rear corridors, were the last to receive warmth and the first to lose it. They existed at the edge of the house's concern, both physically and socially. Servants slept where heat rarely reached. Fires were uncommon, often forbidden outright. Fuel was reserved for public rooms and family use. A servant's warmth came from blankets, shared rooms, and exhaustion. After a day of hauling coal and tending fires elsewhere, there was little left to warm themselves beyond stillness and sleep. These quarters were small, low-ceilinged, and poorly insulated. Sloping roofs and thin walls allowed cold to press inward relentlessly. Windows were minimal, sometimes ill-fitting, admitting drafts without admitting much light. Damp lingered. Air stagnated. Breath was visible here longer than anywhere else in the house. Rising before dawn meant waking into cold already at its worst. There was no gradual easing, no lingering by a fire before the day began. Servants dressed quickly, hands numb, clothing stiff with chill. Water was cold, floors unforgiving. Winter greeted them immediately, without ceremony. The irony was unavoidable. Servants were responsible for creating warmth throughout the house, yet rarely enjoyed its benefits. They revived fires they would not sit beside. They carried coal into rooms they could not rest in. Their labor transformed fuel into comfort for others, while their own quarters remained unchanged. Complaints were not expected and rarely voiced. Cold was understood as part of service. To endure it without protest demonstrated reliability and discipline. Those who struggled were considered unsuited to the role. Winter tested suitability as much as skill. Illness among servants was common and often overlooked. Coughs persisted. Fevers passed untreated beyond rest, when possible. Work continued as long as movement could be managed. Warmth was not prescribed as a cure. The house did not bend its priorities for those who maintained it. Evenings offered little reprieve. After fires were banked and rooms settled, servants returned to cold spaces, carrying the residue of warmth rather than warmth itself. The smell of smoke, the ache of labor. Their rooms cooled quickly once occupied, bodies adding little heat to spaces that resisted it entirely. Shared quarters provided minimal relief. Proximity replaced insulation. Heat was conserved through closeness rather than architecture. Privacy yielded to necessity. Winter dictated arrangements without concern for comfort or preference. These spaces shaped perspective. Servants experienced the house differently from those they served. They knew its coldest corners intimately, felt its drafts most sharply, understood its limits without illusion. Where others saw a warm home, servants saw a structure that rationed comfort carefully and never in their favor. The servants' quarters revealed the house's priorities with clarity. Warmth flowed toward display and authority, not labor. Those who sustained the household endured winter at its harshest so that others might forget it momentarily. In the Victorian home, cold was not shared equally. It settled where resistance was least expected. And nowhere did it linger longer than in the rooms where service ended and endurance began. Cold shaped childhood quietly in the Victorian home. It was not framed as hardship, nor acknowledged as deprivation. It was simply the environment into which children were born, and within which they were expected to grow. Warmth was not promised to them, endurance was. From infancy, children were wrapped, layered, and watched carefully, yet never fully insulated from the house's chill. Nurseries were not heated continuously. Fires were lit when necessary, allowed to fade when not. The air remained cool, steady, and unyielding. Health manuals praised fresh air and warned against excessive warmth. Cold, within limits, was believed to strengthen the constitution. As children grew, exposure increased. They learned early that not every room was meant for comfort. Bedrooms were cold, corridors colder. Play was redirected toward the hearth, not because it was warm, but because it was tolerable. Movement was controlled, both to maintain order and to conserve heat. Clothing served as their primary protection. Woolen undergarments, thick stockings, layered dresses, and jackets restricted movement, but preserved warmth. Complaints were dismissed gently, then firmly. Stiffness was reframed as resilience. Numb fingers were corrected with gloves, not sympathy. Children absorbed these lessons without resistance, adjusting their expectations accordingly. Schooling reinforced this endurance. Lessons took place in rooms scarcely warmer than the rest of the house. Writing required effort. Ink thickened. Breath lingered faintly in the air during colder mornings. Stillness was demanded not only for discipline, but because motion invited chill. Children learned to sit quietly, conserving heat through posture and habit. Illness among children was common, yet rarely attributed to cold rooms directly. Coughs, fevers, and sore throats were accepted as seasonal developments. Remedies focused on rest, diet, and exposure management rather than environmental change. Fires were not intensified. The house remained unchanged. Parents believed they were preparing children for life. Endurance was a virtue. Comfort was temporary. To raise a child accustomed to warmth alone was considered unwise, even dangerous. The world beyond the home would not offer shelter. Winter taught restraint, patience, and acceptance. Play adapted to these realities. Games slowed. Outdoor play was encouraged even in cold weather, reinforcing the belief that fresh air mattered more than warmth. Indoors, play remained contained and subdued. Excessive motion was discouraged near the fire. Space was limited. Heat was shared. Children noticed these rules instinctively. They learned where to stand, when to sit, how close they were permitted to approach the hearth. They learned when warmth was allowed and when it was withdrawn. These boundaries shaped behavior as effectively as instruction. As they grew older, children internalized the cold. They stopped expecting relief. Layers became habitual, stillness natural. Winter ceased to feel temporary. It became a condition of life. Comfort, when it appeared, felt exceptional rather than normal. The Victorian child did not experience warmth as a constant backdrop. It arrived in fragments. Moments by the fire, shared blankets, brief relief before sleep. These fragments were enough to sustain, not enough to spoil. In this way, childhood was shaped by chill, without ever naming it as such. Cold was not an enemy to be defeated. It was a teacher, present every winter, instructing through repetition rather than discipline. Children raised in Victorian homes learned early that warmth was conditional, and that life would require them to endure much without expectation of relief. Sleep in the Victorian home was not an escape from winter. It was an encounter with it, prolonged and unavoidable. Bedrooms were places of rest by intention only. In practice, they punished the body with cold that deepened as the night advanced. The fire that warmed the day was absent here, and its absence defined the hours of darkness. Most bedrooms were never heated. Fires were considered wasteful, where eyes were closed and vigilance impossible. To leave a flame burning overnight risked fuel and safety alike. And so, before sleep began, warmth was deliberately withdrawn. The room cooled steadily, walls and floors reclaiming the chill they had stored since dusk. By midnight, the bedroom matched the season outside more closely than the rooms below. Beds were constructed as defenses. Heavy frames lifted sleepers away from the cold floor. Curtains enclosed the mattress, trapping what little warmth bodies could generate. Blankets multiplied, wool over wool. Quilts waited not for comfort, but for insulation. Even so, the cold found its way in, slipping beneath covers, settling into stillness. Nightcaps were worn not out of fashion, but necessity. The head lost heat quickly. Breath dampened pillows, Moisture accumulated, cooling fabric further. Sleep required immobility, turning exposed skin to air that punished immediately. The body learned to remain still, conserving heat through restraint rather than ease. Children shared beds not for affection alone, but warmth. Siblings were placed together to reduce exposure. Solitude was a luxury winter did not allow. Even then, cold pressed inward from the edges, indifferent to companionship. Waking during the night was unpleasant. A shift, a cough, a moment of restlessness invited awareness of the room's hostility. The warmth gathered beneath covers dissipated quickly. Returning to comfort required patience and stillness. Many lay awake briefly, waiting for the body to reestablish its fragile equilibrium. Morning offered little improvement. The room remained cold until long after sunrise. Dressing occurred quickly, reluctantly, often beneath blankets to preserve heat for as long as possible. Clothing felt stiff, chilled through, unwelcoming. The act of rising was the most difficult of the day, a moment when winter asserted its dominance fully. Illness worsened in such conditions. Fevers rose at night and fell by morning. Coughs deepened. Sleep, meant to restore, often exhausted further. Yet bedrooms remained unchanged. To heat them was considered impractical, indulgent, even morally questionable. Discomfort during sleep was accepted as natural. The house did not acknowledge the bedroom's cruelty. It offered no apology. The expectation was adaptation, not alteration. Sleep became another act of endurance, measured not by comfort, but by the ability to persist until morning. Even the wealthy were not spared entirely. Larger houses meant colder rooms. Fires might be lit briefly before bed, but they died quickly, leaving the same chill behind. Size amplified exposure. Comfort remained elusive, regardless of means. Thus, night became the coldest trial of winter. The body lay still, wrapped and waiting, while the house surrendered fully to the season. Morning, when it came, felt earned rather than welcomed. In the Victorian home, sleep was not restorative by default. It was survived. Bedrooms punished rest, not through cruelty, but through neglect. A quiet reminder that warmth was a daytime concession, and winter ruled the night without opposition. In the Victorian home, cold was not merely endured, it was interpreted. How one responded to winter carried moral weight. Warmth was never simply a physical condition. It was entangled with ideas of discipline, restraint, and respectability. To suffer quietly was admirable. To seek too much comfort was suspect. Endurance was praised as character. A household that tolerated winter without visible complaint demonstrated order and self-control. Fires were kept modest, not only to conserve fuel, but to avoid the appearance of indulgence. Excessive warmth suggested softness, a failure to govern oneself properly. Respectability thrived in moderation, even when moderation meant discomfort. Language softened the reality. Rooms were described as bracing rather than cold. Drafts were invigorating. The chill was framed as healthy, corrective, strengthening. This vocabulary allowed households to accept conditions that might otherwise have seemed intolerable. Cold became a virtue rather than a failing. Women were expected to model this restraint most clearly. Domestic management required balancing comfort with propriety. To complain of cold suggested mismanagement or weakness. To be seen bundled excessively indoors invited judgment. Warmth was pursued discreetly, through layers and careful positioning, never through overt demand. Men, too, were bound by these expectations. A man who lingered too close to the fire risked appearing idle or indulgent. Stillness by the hearth was tolerated only if justified by age, illness, or authority. Otherwise, movement and restraint were expected. Cold sharpened resolve, or so it was believed. Children absorbed these values early. They were taught not to fuss over chill, not to seek warmth unnecessarily. Complaints were corrected gently at first, then firmly. The lesson was clear. Comfort was not owed. It was conditional, temporary, and subordinate to discipline. Servants lived at the sharp edge of this moral framing. Their endurance was assumed, rarely praised. Cold was part of service, and to object would have seemed improper. Respectability demanded silence as much as labor. Visitors encountered this code subtly. A house too warm felt uncomfortable in another way. Heavy, indulgent, morally lax. A cooler parlor suggested restraint and competence. Warmth had to be present, but never obvious. The correct temperature was one that could be tolerated without comment. Medical thought reinforced these attitudes. Cold air was considered beneficial when balanced correctly. Overheated rooms were feared for their potential to weaken the body and mind. Illness was blamed on stagnation as often as chill. This reasoning justified continued exposure even when discomfort was evident. Thus, cold became woven into the social fabric. It was not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be managed with dignity. The house did not fail its occupants by remaining cold. The occupants succeeded by enduring it properly. Winter sharpened these distinctions. As conditions worsened, restraint became more visible. Households that maintained order through the cold demonstrated their moral standing. Those who sought too much comfort risked judgment, regardless of means. In the Victorian home, respectability was measured not by how warm one could make a room, but by how quietly one endured its chill. Cold, disciplined behavior shaped expectation and reinforced hierarchy. It was not merely endured, it was moralized. And so winter did more than lower temperatures. It tested character daily, asking each occupant the same question. Not how warm could you be, but how well could you endure without complaint. Gaslight transformed the Victorian home, but it did not soften it. It pushed back darkness while leaving cold untouched, illuminating rooms that warmth could not reach. In winter, this distinction mattered deeply. Light extended the day, but it did not make it kinder. When gas was lit at dusk, rooms appeared suddenly alive. Shadows retreated. Furniture emerged. Walls seemed closer, more manageable. The glow suggested comfort, activity, control. Yet the air remained unchanged. Cold persisted, indifferent to illumination. The flame burned above eye level, offering brightness without heat, presence without relief. This separation altered evening life. Tasks once limited by daylight could now continue, but they were carried out in rooms growing steadily colder. Reading strained hands that numbed quickly. Writing slowed as ink thickened and fingers stiffened. Sewing became deliberate, careful, confined to the smallest motions necessary. Light enabled work, but cold governed how long it could last. The illusion of warmth was powerful. A lit room felt occupied, ordered, civilized. Yet occupants quickly learned that light did not equal comfort. The fire remained the only true source of heat, and its reach did not expand simply because the room was illuminated. Gaslight revealed the cold more clearly than darkness ever had. Gas fixtures themselves contributed nothing to warmth. Their flames were contained, controlled, deliberately restrained. Safety demanded it. Heat, when present, was minimal and quickly lost upward. The house glowed but did not warm. Winter's authority remained intact. Even the act of lighting the gas carried a chill. Valves were turned with cold fingers. Matches struck reluctantly. The brief warmth of flame passed instantly. The room brightened, but the body felt no change. This contrast reinforced the reality. Light could be summoned easily, warmth could not. Social habits adjusted accordingly. Evenings extended, but not comfortably. Visits were shorter. Conversation slowed as cold reclaimed attention. The fire's decline mattered more once gaslight removed darkness as a natural endpoint. There was no longer a reason to retreat except discomfort itself. Gaslight also altered the perception of space. Rooms that had once disappeared into darkness at night now remained visible, revealing cold corners and unused furniture abandoned to winter. The house felt larger, emptier, more exposed. Darkness had hidden the cold. Light revealed it. Bedrooms fared no better. Gaslight allowed preparation for sleep without candles, but it did not alter the room's hostility. The bed waited cold regardless of illumination. Light accompanied the final moments of warmth, then extinguished itself, leaving winter to reclaim the space entirely. Servants experienced this contrast acutely. Gaslight extended their labor into later hours, but fires did not burn longer to compensate. Work continued in colder conditions, made possible by light alone. Illumination demanded endurance without offering comfort in return. The cultural promise of gaslight was progress, longer days, increased productivity, improved order. Yet winter exposed its limits. Progress illuminated discomfort rather than resolving it. The house appeared modern, while remaining physically unchanged. In this way, gaslight sharpened awareness of cold rather than alleviating it. It stripped away the excuse of darkness, leaving winter plainly visible and unavoidable. The Victorian home could be bright, orderly, and active, and still profoundly cold. Light without warmth extended winter's reach into every visible corner. It allowed life to continue, but never to soften. And so gaslight stood as a symbol of the age itself, progress that illuminated hardship clearly, without removing it at all. Winter in the Victorian home did not feel seasonal. It felt extended, drawn out beyond the boundaries of calendar and weather. Cold arrived early, lingered late, and settled into habits that outlasted frost itself. Even when the air outside softened, the house remained reluctant to release winter's hold. The season began quietly. A cooler morning. A fire lit earlier than usual, curtains drawn before dusk. These adjustments accumulated until winter was fully present indoors, long before snow ever fell. By the time frost appeared on windows, the house had already reorganized itself around cold. Once established, winter refused to hurry. Weeks passed with little variation. The same rooms used, the same routines repeated, the same endurance practiced daily. Cold became background rather than event. Its constancy was more exhausting than any storm. Victorian winters felt longer because relief was incremental. A mild day offered little change inside thick-walled houses that absorbed cold slowly and released it even more slowly. Fires worked against accumulated chill, not against the present moment alone. Each thaw was delayed indoors, arriving days after it was felt outside. This delay distorted time. Spring hinted, but did not arrive. Windows remained shut. Fires continued. Clothing layers stayed in place. The body sensed change before the house acknowledged it. Winter overstayed, not dramatically, but persistently. Social life reflected this elongation. visits postponed, travel delayed, projects deferred. Winter imposed caution that extended beyond necessity. Even when conditions improved, habits of restraint remained. It took weeks to trust that warmth might return. Children felt this length keenly. Play remained constrained. Outdoor activity was limited long after cold had technically receded. The house taught patience through repetition. Winter seemed endless because there was no clear moment of release. The elderly marked time by endurance rather than dates. Each week survived was a small victory. Stiffness eased slowly, if at all. Recovery lagged behind the season. Winter's effects lingered in the body even as daylight increased. Fuel supplies tracked this drawn-out reality. Coal was rationed longer than anticipated. Late-season scarcity caused renewed anxiety. Fires burned cautiously well into months that promised warmth, but had not yet delivered it indoors. Even the house itself bore winter's duration. Walls retained damp. Chimneys continued to draw cold air. Floors remained chilled. Spring cleaning addressed residue rather than relief. The house did not reset easily. When warmth finally returned, it did so unevenly. One room softened. Another remained stubbornly cold. Windows opened cautiously. Fires were extinguished reluctantly. Winter was not dismissed. It was edged out slowly, room by room, habit by habit. The long Victorian winter was not measured by storms or snow, but by persistence. It tested patience more than strength. It demanded acceptance rather than resistance. Its length was felt not in days, but in the number of times one endured the same cold morning again. Winter ended eventually, but it did not conclude cleanly. It faded, leaving behind habits of restraint and a lingering respect for the cold that would return. In the Victorian home, winter was never brief. It was an extended condition of life, endured quietly, until the house itself finally agreed to let it go. Winter announced itself most clearly in the small acts that required precision. Writing was one of them. In the Victorian home, letters were composed slowly, deliberately, with hands that often struggled to obey intention. Ink froze. Fingers stiffened. Thought moved faster than the body could follow. Writing desks were rarely positioned for warmth. They sat near windows to catch daylight, or in studies that winter had long since claimed. Fires were reserved for parlors and shared rooms, not for solitary tasks. To write was to accept cold as a condition of expression. Ink thickened quickly in winter air. Pens hesitated, dragging faintly across paper. Blots were common, not from carelessness, but from numb fingers that failed to regulate pressure. Writers paused often, hands held near the fire or tucked beneath arms, waiting for sensation to return long enough to continue. Letters lengthened and shortened according to temperature. Thoughts were condensed, not by choice, but by physical limitation. Long correspondence required endurance. Short notes became practical solutions. Winter shaped communication as surely as it shaped movement. The act of writing exposed vulnerability. Fingers, stripped of gloves for precision, suffered first. Cold numbed joints, slowed motion, dulled sensation. Each word demanded effort. To continue writing in such conditions was a quiet act of determination. Children learned penmanship in cold rooms, their handwriting reflecting discomfort. Lines wavered. Letters grew uneven. Teachers corrected form without acknowledging environment. Skill was expected to triumph over sensation. Discipline replaced comfort. Even professional correspondence was subject to winter's restraint. Clerks worked in cold offices, coats worn indoors, breath faintly visible. Productivity slowed. Errors increased. Yet the expectation remained. Work continued despite the cold, not because of relief from it. At home, letters were often written near the fire, but never too close. Heat warped paper. Smoke threatened ink. The compromise left hands cold enough to ache, warm enough to function briefly. Writers shifted constantly, balancing proximity and practicality. The content of letters rarely mentioned this discomfort. Cold hands were not noteworthy, they were assumed. Writers noted weather outside more readily than conditions within. To mention numb fingers would have been redundant, perhaps indulgent. Ink stains and cramped handwriting became seasonal artifacts. Winter letters looked different, tighter, more deliberate, occasionally shakier. These traces remain visible in archives, quiet evidence of conditions rarely described explicitly. Writing was one of the few acts that required stillness without warmth. Movement could generate heat. Writing demanded restraint. The body cooled while the mind worked. Endurance was measured in paragraphs. When warmth returned, writing changed subtly. Hands moved more freely. Ink flowed. Letters lengthened. Yet winter's influence lingered. Brevity remained habitual. Restraint persisted even when no longer required. In the Victorian home, winter reached into language itself. It shaped how much was said, how carefully, and for how long. Letters written with numb hands carried more than words. They carried the quiet endurance of a season that allowed expression, but never made it easy. The Victorian home was celebrated as a refuge, a private world sealed against the dangers of the street, the factory, the weather beyond its walls. Within its doors, order was meant to reign. Family, routine, and respectability were believed to offer protection. Yet winter exposed how fragile this security truly was. The house stood firm against wind and rain, but cold slipped through unnoticed. It entered without force, settling into walls, floors, and habits. No lock could bar it. No curtain could fully contain it. The illusion lay in believing that shelter alone equaled safety. Domestic security depended on constant effort. Fires had to be fed. Fuel had to be afforded. Labor had to continue, uninterrupted. Any failure, illness, shortage, fatigue, threatened the household's balance immediately. Warmth was not guaranteed by ownership of a house, but by the ability to sustain it daily. Even the well-appointed home was vulnerable. A broken grate, a delayed coal delivery, a servant's illness could plunge rooms into cold quickly. The house offered no redundancy. Its systems were simple, exposed, and unforgiving. Winter tolerated no lapse. Families understood this vulnerability instinctively. Anxiety accompanied prolonged cold spells. Supplies were counted repeatedly. The fire was watched closely. Comfort was enjoyed cautiously, aware of how easily it could be withdrawn. Security felt provisional, dependent on forces beyond control. The sense of protection the home offered was therefore psychological as much as physical. Familiar walls and routines reassured occupants, even as those same walls leaked cold steadily. The house felt safer than the street, yet never fully safe. Winter reminded everyone of this distinction. Children absorbed this lesson early. Home was not a place of guaranteed comfort, but of managed survival. Warmth existed because someone worked to produce it. When that work faltered, the house revealed its limits without hesitation. Illness tested the illusion further. A sick child or parent required warmth the house struggled to provide. Fires burned longer. Fuel disappeared faster. security frayed as resources thinned. Care competed with conservation. The house could shelter, but not always heal. The Victorian emphasis on domesticity masked this fragility. Manuals praised the home as moral sanctuary, yet offered few solutions for winter hardship beyond discipline and thrift. Responsibility was placed on individuals rather than structures. Endurance replaced expectation. Thus, the house's security rested on resilience rather than protection. It did not prevent hardship, it managed it. It offered continuity, not comfort. Winter made this clear by pressing against every surface until belief yielded to experience. When spring arrived, the illusion regained strength. Windows opened. Fires diminished. The house felt benevolent again. Yet memory lingered of cold rooms, rationed warmth, and nights endured rather than enjoyed. In the Victorian home, security was real only so long as winter allowed it. Shelter did not guarantee ease. It promised survival, contingent on effort and restraint. The illusion of domestic security held, but only because its limits were accepted quietly, season after season. By the time winter loosened its hold, endurance had already done its work. The Victorian household did not celebrate survival. It did not mark the season's end with relief or reflection. Winter was not something conquered. It was something born, quietly, persistently, and without expectation of acknowledgement. Endurance was the unspoken rule that governed every cold room and rationed fire. To complain openly about the cold was to misunderstand one's place within the house and within society itself. Discomfort was not a failing of the home. It was evidence that life was being conducted properly, with restraint, foresight, and moral seriousness. Silence mattered. Cold was discussed only when it became dangerous, never when it was merely unpleasant. A stiff morning, numb fingers, a breath visible indoors. These were not grievances. They were confirmations that winter was proceeding as expected. To speak of them too often suggested fragility, even indulgence. This silence shaped behavior. People learned to adjust without drawing attention to themselves. Layers were added discreetly. Chairs were shifted subtly closer to the fire. Tasks were delayed without explanation. Endurance operated through habit rather than declaration. Children learned this lesson early. Complaints were corrected gently, then discouraged entirely. The child who learned to endure cold without fuss was praised implicitly, trusted more, treated as capable. Winter became a proving ground where character was quietly assessed. Adults internalized the same expectations. A woman who managed her household through winter without visible strain demonstrated competence. A man who tolerated cold without complaint reinforced authority. Servants who endured quietly were considered reliable. Endurance became a measure of worth. The house itself reflected this ethic. It was not altered radically to prevent cold. It was managed, adjusted, worked around. Structural change implied dissatisfaction, perhaps even rebellion against accepted order. Better to adapt oneself than to demand adaptation from walls and floors. Illness tested this restraint, but rarely broke it. Care expanded cautiously. Extra blankets were added. Fires burned slightly longer. Yet even then, the underlying ethic remained. Warmth was given carefully, never freely. The house did not transform itself for suffering. It accommodated it within limits. When spring arrived, endurance did not end. It simply became less visible. Habits formed during winter lingered. Fires were lit cautiously, even as days warmed. Layers remained longer than necessary. The body retained memory of cold long after its departure. There was no reckoning at winter's end, no acknowledgement of what had been endured. Survival was not a narrative, it was a condition. Winter passed, as it always had, leaving behind a household that had done what was required of it without spectacle. This quiet endurance shaped Victorian life profoundly. It reinforced hierarchy, discipline, and restraint. It taught that comfort was conditional and transient, that hardship need not be explained to be understood. In the Victorian home, warmth was never a right. It was a temporary concession, earned daily and surrendered without protest. Cold did not demand heroism. It demanded compliance. And so winter ruled without resistance, not because it was undefeatable, but because endurance, silent, habitual, unquestioned, was considered the proper response. That was how Victorian homes stayed warm when they could, and endured when they could not.